Way back in May, in the main puff piece aimed at selling Star Wars The Acolyte, the New York Times wrote, when Leslie Headland got the chance to create an actual Star Wars show, it was the realization of a lifelong dream, and a chance for humiliating failure on a galactic scale. Now that galactic scale humiliation is complete. Let's dive in. In the late hours of August 19th, Deadline Hollywood broke the exclusive that The Acolyte has been cancelled and there will be no second season for Disney's Star Wars series. Before we move on, let's take a moment to appreciate how major that is. Not that The Acolyte won't be getting a season 2, that was a sound business decision considering the abysmal ratings and reception, but that the cancellation is getting this kind of coverage in a major Hollywood trade because that never happens. No one ever announces that this or that project has been cancelled, they just gradually stop talking about it while it's quietly memory hold, like Obi-Wan Kenobi. For regular network shows, Deadline Hollywood may do one feature story a year on which series have been picked up for another season, and so by implication, which must have been cancelled. But a story like this, that a high-profile series has actively been cancelled, that almost never happens. So that this story was published here, in Deadline Hollywood, from where it will be picked up all over the world, means someone is sending a message, and it ain't Kathleen Kennedy or Leslie Headland. Let's read the story proper. Exclusive, the story of The Acolyte will not continue, with Lucasfilm opting not to proceed with the second season of the Star Wars offshoot starring Amandla Stenberg, sources tell Deadline. Right, sources, whose identities will be known to Deadline Hollywood. This is not an official announcement, but still, someone within the Disney system wants the world to know how big a fail The Acolyte was, which means the complete and total humiliation of Leslie Headland, who was set up to take the fall in that New York Times piece. But it's also humiliating for Kathleen Kennedy, as that very New York Times piece credits her with telling Leslie Headland, "You've written a great Star Wars show. Now go write a Leslie Headland show," which retroactively demonstrates how completely out of touch Kennedy was for allowing this, so she doesn't get away from this unscathed either. Let's move on with Deadline Hollywood's coverage. Word of the decision comes more than a month after the 8-episode first season of the series from creator, director, executive producer, and showrunner Leslie Headland wrapped its run on Disney+. So yeah, no doubt about who's getting blamed here. The news is not entirely surprising. The Acolyte did okay with critics, with 78% on Rotten Tomatoes, but divided Star Wars fans, which was reflected in its overall viewership. That it divided Star Wars fans, of course, is code for that apart from the smallest minority of pixie dusters, everyone hated it. Deadline Hollywood then breaks down the early streaming numbers, when there was some level of interest, before concluding with, but The Acolyte could not sustain the momentum, dropping out of the top 10 in week 3 and staying off before returning at number 10 after the release of the finale, which saw 335 million minutes watched, believed to be the lowest for a Star Wars series finale. Like fellow global streamers Netflix and Prime Video, Disney Plus has a high viewership threshold for renewing high-end, big-budget series that cost well above $100 million per season to make. That's Deadline Hollywood saying The Acolyte is too big a flop to even contemplate a second season, so this should come as no surprise to anyone involved. The story continues. In interviews, Headland has revealed that she had pitched her ideas for a second season, sharing her hopes for a renewal. What they neglected to mention here is that Headland also begged the fans of the series, the shippers, the true toxic fans, to share their fan art and to campaign for a second season in social media. But evidently, the series just didn't have enough fans to make any kind of impact. Rubbing the cancellation in, Deadline Hollywood then more or less concludes Lucasfilm's first and most successful to date Disney Plus series, The Mandalorian, is carrying on, crossing over to features with the upcoming The Mandalorian and Grogu. Ahsoka, the company series that preceded The Acolyte, has been renewed for a second season. That's pretty brutal, but there was something else that Deadline Hollywood also neglected to mention. Let's go back to that original New York Times spin piece to look at the series' main selling point, other than the lesbian space witches singing cult-like songs about the power of one, the power of two, and the power of many. The New York Times wrote, "Some trolls have nicknamed Headland series the Wokalite." In a brief telephone interview, Kennedy's support for The Acolyte was steadfast. "My belief is that storytelling does need to be representative of all people," she said. "That's an easy decision for me." Well, it may have been an easy decision for her, but her fundamental belief about storytelling, that it needs to be representative of all people, is just flat out wrong. And this was just yet another data point in what is starting to be a very, very long line of data points to prove that. Making stories that are representative of all people means no people will be watching. For Leslie Headland and Kathleen Kennedy, this is just an embarrassing, humiliating failure, and both of them would no doubt have preferred the series be renewed for multiple more seasons, vindicating their belief in diversity and lesbian space witches. But given that the series had to be cancelled, they would have preferred it just sink quietly into oblivion, getting memory hold in silence without anyone noticing, rather than its failure and their humiliation being made explicit and shouted from the rooftops to the whole world the way that it just was. And that it was means someone relatively high up in the Lucasfilm or Disney chain of command wanted to tar and feather them in the eyes of the public, because that was obviously the purpose of this leak to Deadline Hollywood. The only way this gets any more humiliating for Kennedy and Headland is if Bob Iger decides to pull another Zaslaw and do to The Acolyte what he already did to the lesbian-themed Willow series. That is, pull it from Disney Plus servers, erase it from canon, claim a tax credit, and make it so it never happened. Which honestly would be the only right thing to do with a franchise-breaking disaster like The Acolyte. Let's wait and see what Iger does, and if Amandla Stenberg will make another diss track going after the fans. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments.